So I was going to name this episode Why Poetry, because I got a really good email from Shane in which he asked, among other things, he said, why poetry? As a sort of a question directed at me specifically. Why poetry? And I thought, well, that's a great name for an episode. And then I remembered there's already a book called Why Poetry that was a big hit and a bestseller, and was on all the interview shows, and it was written by Matthew fucking Zapruder. And I thought, if by some chance my podcast were to bring the work of Matthew Zapruder to one slight degree of greater glory or attention than it's already received, then I will have failed in my vocation. So I came up with the other name for this episode. Just know that in a perfect world, in a parallel universe, without Matthew Zapruder, in a Zapruder-free universe, this episode would be called Why Poetry, and with no question mark, by the way, with no question mark, because as with the Robert De Niro film, I think slightly underrated Robert De Niro film, What Just Happened, it's not a question but an answer, or at least an acknowledgement of an attempt to answer the question. Because I was thinking about Shane's question. I've been thinking about it for probably a couple months now, and I got a text message the other night from Elijah, who hosts the Versecraft podcast, and he said something. We were talking about a different poet, but he says he says, unlike you and me, he doesn't care much about poetry as a distinct art form. He capitalized poetry and put it in quotation marks. So he was saying, you and I care about poetry as a distinct art form, and that wasn't even the point of his statement. That was like a given. That was an understood condition that effectively went without saying. He was just bringing it up in order to highlight this sort of exceptional circumstance. And it was when I saw him say, you and I, or me and you, because he's unpretentious, unlike me. Elijah is very well spoken and exceptionally clear-headed and eloquent, but he's also totally unpretentious. So he said, me and you care about poetry as a distinct category. And that was when I realized I was in much deeper shit with Shane than I had thought, because one MFA, 40 years and 100 episodes in, when it comes to the question of caring about poetry as a distinct art form, I realized I actually don't. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to Slee Ricketts. Thank you all for listening. Thank you. Thank you all for listening. Oh man, it's been a fucked up day. Thank you for listening. And I hope you all had a good time at AWP, and you've recovered from your hangovers and marital crises and whatever else, and sold a lot of books and made a lot of connections and got your job and resolved all major and minor literary crises. I also hope you took an opportunity to tell somebody there about Slee Ricketts and how he, she, or they might enjoy it. If you didn't, then maybe do so this week. Tell somebody that you respect about the show. That's how people find out about it. That's what it makes a big difference, and I appreciate it. Thank you also to everybody who subscribes to The Secret Show. We've picked up some new subscribers. Welcome, everybody. If you have yet to check it out, go to sleeverickets.substack.com, and it's super cheap. It's cheapest to get it to pay yearly. It's still pretty cheap to pay monthly, and then if you are If you are rich, there's an option just for you, exclusive, only for you, to pay a little extra. And of course, if the money is a problem, then just send me a fucking email at sleeprickets@gmail.com and it'll be fine. This is episode 100. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, except that I either over or under prepared for this episode. I have been thinking about it for a long time, and I wanted to find some poems to talk about. So while excluding everything that I have already talked about on the show and just trying to pull up poems I had ready to hand, that I really loved, that I really thought would be really gratifying to talk about, I, within 5 minutes had 20 poems in my hands and realized that's probably too many. So I cut it down to 10, which is still way too many. So I don't know how many of those I'm going to get to, but I have a big question to answer. So I thought I would try to arm myself as well as I could. The question I have to answer is Shane's. He wrote an email a while back in response to a conversation that Cameron and I had on Sleeve Rickerson on The Secret Show about the new formalism. And we talked a little bit about difficulty. This was when we got into, we butted heads slightly over Gerard Manley Hopkins, and Shane came down pretty adamantly on Cameron's end of that argument. He had, I think, a really thoughtful question though. So I'm just going to read from his email. I've alluded to it before. He brings up information, but this is the question in its full form, and I think it's worth reading because it's a thoughtful and a smart one. He said, "I'd like to ask." He said, and by the way, I mentioned Shane a lot on the show. If you don't know who he is, Shane McRae is a brilliant poet and a sweet and lovely man. Curmudgeonly, perhaps sometimes, but who among us is not curmudgeonly at times? That said, I'd like to ask you a big question, Matthew. He says, why poetry? Why poetry? Why not fiction or even nonfiction, the essay? As far as I can tell, what you seem to want from poetry is information. You seem to want poetry to do the same thing prose does, except in a more musical and perhaps more compressed and or compact way. Now, there is very musical prose, and there is very compressed prose, and there is very compact prose. What is it that you want from poetry that you can't get from prose? What is it that you want from poetry that is more or less particular to poetry? He goes on, with regard to what you said on the most recent episode of The Secret Show, you seem to have tried to contradict the claim that wanting accessibility is laziness. This is an ongoing debate, long ongoing debate, started much further back than the existence of this show, about whether accessibility is a virtue or difficulty is a virtue in poetry, or whether either of these things is actually a weakness or a deficiency. So he says, you seem to have tried to contradict the claim that wanting accessibility is laziness. Right? That's often the claim. If you want poetry to be accessible, that's just because you're a lazy reader. And he says, well, you're trying to contradict that, but your contradiction to that claim, your rebuttal to that claim is itself flawed. He says, you seem to have tried to contradict the claim that wanting accessibility is laziness by justifying laziness in the context of a commercial exchange. A commercial exchange. Why shouldn't a reader put in the work only to be disappointed sometimes? To some extent, listening to the episode made me sad because it sounded like you wanted your relationship to poetry to be, I paid for a ticket to a show, give me a show. Tell me it's more than that. Or am I a sap for wanting it to be more than that? No. I don't. First of all, I don't think you're ever a sap for wanting poetry to be more than it might appear to be at any given moment, or than it might be given credit for being. I don't think you're ever a sap for that, or rather, you're only as much of a sap as all of us are saps for giving a shit about poetry to begin with. So that's my answer to that last part of the question. There's so many questions and sub-questions here under this larger umbrella of why poetry that I think it's maybe worth breaking them up a little bit. I do think that, I mentioned a few episodes back that I sort of object a little bit to, because this claim that accessible poetry is is a product. This is sort of pandering to commercial culture, to consumerism, that this is failing to challenge capitalism, etc. I really, really resist this argument, again, because poems are free. Poems are free. Matt Wall wrote in to say, hey, poems may be free, but poetry books aren't free, and publishers certainly are not worried about giving things away for free. And that's all true, and that's all fine. But if you are a poet, you know that any given poem you write, and the poetry books are really only very briefly meaningful objects. It is always really the individual poems that survive. The individual poems are free. They are infinitely, effortlessly reproducible. It couldn't be easier to distribute them. Similarly, if you are a reader of poetry, this is what I do every fucking week. I link to all of these poems in my show notes, and you get to read them for free. So whether you read poetry or write poetry, very seldom is commerce even theoretically a part of it. So I do think that the commercial exchange idea is a really flawed one, and not just on technical grounds, right? Because when you do when you do give something your attention that you haven't paid for, then you are giving something more of yourself than merely payment for a ticket. I guess my follow-up to that quarrel, this objection that, it sounds like you're saying I paid for a ticket to a show, give me a show. First of all, again, seldom is payment for a ticket even part of the bargain. That said, I had a conversation with my sister-in-law and my brother about books. They're both big readers. They buy a lot of books, and they were talking about how great it is always to buy used books, because then you're not paying into the larger publishing monster. And that's true enough, but I actually make a point of trying to buy new books if I'm buying a book by a living author. If I'm buying a book by a dead author, fine. Used all day. Great. Whatever. But if it's a living author, I actually make a point of trying to buy those books, because that's the only way the author gets any credit or any money for it. But that's really that's effectively charity, right? That has very little to do with the actual reading of the poem, the experience of reading the poem, the experience of writing the poem, the experience of conveying the poem to another person. So of the, handful of really nice conversations I've had with people who read poems of mine and thought something about them, only in a small number of cases was there even any purchase theoretically occurring at any point in the exchange. And I am glad for you to buy my book. I hope with any luck, a second book soon enough. But I just don't think that's really honestly part of what we're talking about when we talk about reading and loving a poem, or writing a poem in hopes that people will read it and love it. I just think that's sort of a separate game. Also, speaking as someone who's spent decades in theater, I paid for a ticket to a show, give me a show, is an honest and worthy sentiment. Isn't that what you want? What is actually wrong with that? Honestly, I think one of the big problems with theater today is that it doesn't care enough about the experience of the people who would pay for a ticket and come to the show. I think it cares far more about the people who are giving the grants to the larger organizations. You can see my conversation with Brian about problems with the NEA. But I would also say that this argument, why shouldn't a reader put in the work only to be disappointed sometimes, is spoken to me, what that sounds like is somebody who reads really, really fucking quickly. I would wager, based on the conversations I've had with you, Shane, and with plenty of the people who listen to this podcast, as I always say, many very smart people, much smarter than I am, certainly much better read than I am. My constant impression is that you not only have read much more than I have, but that you read far quicker. And by far quicker, I mean 5 to 10 times quicker. I don't know about you, but it takes me quite a while to read a poem honestly. Some of that may be my tendency to need to, the same reason, maybe the same reason that like I have to like flick the door lock several times, the same number of times on the different door locks at night before I go to bed. And like there's some of that residual stuff left over from my childhood. And I have a hard time not rereading sentences over and over again as I'm reading even a short poem. But even when I'm at my best, I read very slowly, very slowly. It's a big investment to pick up a book and read it. And I think it does matter a little bit that if it's a total waste, particularly if the author didn't really give a shit what I experienced. I mean, I'm reading a book right now. I'm in the middle of it. This tells you something. I'm reading a book right now that is a book of poetry, like a 70-page book of poetry, lyric poems. And I started reading it, and I've spent an hour or so reading it today, and I'm halfway through. And it's fine. It's pretty good. It's a lot of it feels a little less than urgent. A lot of it feels artful enough. Certainly there's some skill. Certainly there's some consideration. There's some practice. There's some training that's gone into it. I mean, I think this is a poet who cares about the reader's experience, who cares about what the poem is doing to anybody other than the poet himself. But in the end, most of it, and there's some exceptions. I mean, I think there's at least one poem in there that's pretty fucking good. But for the most part, and this is totally something you could say about my first book as well, a lot of it feels like this exists in order for the person writing it to be a poet, or vice versa. Like, I am a poet and therefore I have written these poems. It's part of a poet working out his own identity. And this is a poet who has stopped writing since then. Put out one book 10 years ago, stopped writing. And is a hell of a lot better than a lot of people who've kept publishing books. But finally seems to have made an assessment, I mean, for whatever reason, seems to have made an assessment and said, I don't need to do this. Or rather, I don't need this to be something I do publicly. That's really, I guess, what I'm talking about when I talk about like the poet needing to give the reader's experience some consideration. It's not that playing with language and exploring possibilities with words and combinations of words is bad or pointless. It's not. It's just that a lot of contemporary poetry, and maybe this bothers me more because it takes me so much longer to read it, a lot of contemporary poetry feels like it's people dicking around for their own benefit. So, no, I mean, honestly, like, I do pay for a ticket to the show in that, like, I make a point of buying a lot of poetry books new that I could easily either read online or get used or, get the highlights from one place or another, or just get a copy. I mean, I get plenty of books for free as well. But, the rule tends to hold that like the people who are given the most books for free also pay for the most books. So like I'm like single-handedly supporting our local bookstore. But that's not what I object to, right? Like I don't object to the fact that I paid for the book. I object just as much when I spend, I mean, more so often, because when I buy a book, I'm often buying it because I know the person. I'm buying it because I want to support somebody. I'm buying it because I know I ought to have a copy of it in my library. But typically when I get really frustrated, it's when I am reading something online that somebody has praised to the skies, and I think, this fucking sucks. This does nothing for me, and I don't even think the poet cared to have it do anything to me. I don't think the poet cared about my experience. So yeah, I mean, to that extent, I think you are right to call me crass and shallow as a reader, but I don't think I'm necessarily wrong to be. Getting back to the earlier question, though, about why I read poetry, why I care about poetry, it did send me back to that William Carlos Williams' third most famous quote. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. This comes, I believe, from Asphodel, that greeny flower. And typically the parts of this sentence that people focus on are the difficulty in getting the news and the death, that there's something necessary. The news is difficult to get and it's necessary. And it's come up on this podcast. We have quoted and misquoted it before on this podcast. But what stood out to me this time, when it came to mind in answer to Shane's question, was this last part, for lack of what is found there. And I thought, well, when Elijah talked about poetry as a category, and Shane said, why poetry rather than prose, rather than all these other genres of writing? I thought, I don't know. I mean, we talked before about the difficulty of defining poetry in any meaningful sense. But a partial answer that came to mind was whether or not I care about poetry as a category. When I read poems, I often find things of value there. Or rather, there are things of value that I tend to find more often in poems than in other places. And it's not that I couldn't find any one of them somewhere else. It's not that I couldn't find any one of these in a book of prose, or even all of them in a book of prose. But maybe they tend to crop up more frequently in poems. Again, it's not unlike Alan Tate's outdated crack about loving poems and loving women. To love women is to love a small minority of women. Right? To love poems is to love a tiny fraction of the poems that are written. And maybe Kinsey would say, like, well, we're all on the spectrum of sexuality. Maybe if the right man walked in, or the right whatever else. I mean, I think there's probably truth to that too. But what's also true is, like, maybe the qualities that one finds appealing crop up more often in one category than another. And the truth for me is that, like, it's not that I like poetry to the exclusion of prose, or I like poetry to the exclusion of dialogue. I also like those things. I tend to savor those genres, verse, prose, dialogue, for the qualities that crop up most often there, respectively. Anyway, here are some of the things I think I find in poems, I find valuable in poems, and whether or not there is anywhere in this series of virtues or pleasures, whether there is any quality that is exclusively found in poetry, I'm not sure I can say. But in answer to the challenge that all I care about is information, I thought I would start by reading a poem in which much of what I find that has value in it is information. But maybe not in quite the same limited terms that Shane suggests. So I heard from Maury Creech many years ago on a porch while chain smoking Luckies and drinking up all of Joe Harrison's beer. I heard from him that he was once at a James Dickey reading. And Dickey was characteristically drunk as a skunk. And he got to a poem called The Performance. Poem from his first book, I believe. And he said that when he was in the war, he had a friend who died. And when he got home from the war, he wanted to write immortal poetry about his friend. And the line that Maury quoted, he said that right before starting the poem, Dickey said, "But I did not know how to write immortal poetry then." And then this poem was the follow-up, because of course this is the poem he wrote about it later. This is a poem in which much of what he does is simply convey information. There is an image of a man standing on his head. This image recurs in a couple different forms. There's some slightly surreal shifting of scene. He uses the verb topple to switch from one scene to another, and he manages tone in, I think, a fairly delicate way. And I think that it is not that in many places the language flashily demonstrates that it is purely untranslatable. It's just that it would be difficult to find fewer or better or clearer words in which to convey this information. And in fact, I think part of what Dickey maybe learned when he matured as a poet was that there are certain subjects that don't require decoration. They just require clear telling and perhaps the right artful but restrained framing. And I think that's really what he does here. He tells a true story, or at least a story that he convinces us is true, and he frames it. He chooses how to begin it, how to end it, and in what words and images to make it digestible, to make it possible for us to swallow something that is on its face so difficult to take in. So this is the performance. It's about his friend in the Pacific in World War II. The last time I saw Donald Armstrong, he was staggering oddly off into the sun, going down of the Philippine Islands. I let my shovel fall and put that hand above my eyes and moved some way to one side that his body might pass through the sun. And I saw how well he was not standing there on his hands. On his spindle-shanked forearms, balanced, unbalanced, with his big feet looming and waving in the great, untrustworthy air, he flew in each night when it darkened. This is, I think, an extremely artful stanza, though a pretty unflashy one. He's described his friend standing on his head, and he's not very good at it. Standing on his hand, sorry. He's not very good at it. He's wobbling. You saw how well he was not standing there on his hands. The big feet looming and waving in the great untrustworthy air. We've moments earlier seen Dickey toss down a shovel. He's using to dig out probably a latrine or something on the beach. But that shovel is not a wasted gesture. He's supplying the mise en scène, to use my fancy drama major jargon. His big feet looming and waving in the great untrustworthy air he flew in each night when it darkened. These are fighter pilots, and they're dicking around on the beach in between missions. He goes on, dust fanned in scraped puffs from the earth between his arms, and blood turned his face inside out to demonstrate its suppleness of veins as he perfected his role. There's a fragility, a delicacy, but also there's something extraordinary about this biological machine. Next day, as the same stanza, next day he toppled his head off on an island beach to the south. Next day he toppled his head off after that description of him standing on his hands could be a joke, could be a further elaboration of this guy's clumsiness, but then it gets real specific. On an island beach to the south. Somehow that to the south makes it land a little more firmly. Oh no, this is a real event. All the silliness, all the figurative language, turning his face inside out, suddenly this becomes much more concrete and present. The next stanza, and the enemy's two-handed sword did not fall from anyone's hands. At that miraculous sight, as the head rolled over upon its wide-eyed face and fell into the inadequate grave he had dug for himself under pressure. That is pretty fucking economical, and yet extremely evocative. And the enemy's two-handed sword did not fall from anyone's hands at that miraculous sight, as the head rolled over upon its wide-eyed face and fell into the inadequate grave he had dug for himself under pressure. He got beheaded by the Japanese. His plane went down, he got beheaded, he was captured and killed. And all of the wonder of this guy's living body that Dickey's observing earlier, the suppleness of his veins, that this could be severed, that his head could roll off of his body into a hole in the sand. Somehow, as unthinkable as this was, as miraculous as this sight is in his imagination, nobody was particularly surprised by it. The enemy's two-handed sword did not fall from anyone's hands. It's a small connection, the hands and the two-handed, but again, just making it a two-handed sword, which maybe is accurate, but it also becomes a little more real as a result. Yet I put my flat hand to my eyebrows months later to see him again in the sun, when I learned how he died. I can't help but read a little bit, maybe, the suggestion that the big Southern macho soldier, when he hears that his friend was beheaded, puts his hand to his eyes, not just to block out the sun so he can see him on the horizon, but maybe out of modesty, maybe in a moment of being overwhelmed by emotion and not wanting to reveal it. Yet I put my flat hand to my eyebrows months later to see him again in the sun, when I learned how he died, and imagined him there, come judged before his small captors. Today I think maybe we read it with a critical eye and a concern for racial stereotype, but there is something devastating about the small captors. Fair or unfair, this is how he imagines it. Tall Donald Armstrong, wobbly Donald Armstrong, spindle-shanked Donald Armstrong, come judged before his small captors, doing all his lean tricks to amaze them. The back somersault, the kip-up, and at last the stand on his hands, perfect, with his feet together, his head down, evenly breathing. This is the dream. This is the imagined version. Of course, in life, he was not good at this. In life, he was much more wobbly. But in the dream, in Dickey's imagination, he does all of his tricks for his captors. The back somersault, the kip up, and at last the stand on his hands, perfect with his feet together, his head down, evenly breathing, as the sun poured up from the sea and the headsman broke down in a blaze of tears. In that light of the thin, long human frame, upside down in its own strange joy. For a moment, the headsman in Dickey's imagination is like Dickey. He can't believe what he's seeing. It's too strange. It's too beautiful. And if some other one had not told him, would have cut off the feet instead of the head. And if Armstrong had not presently risen in kingly, round-shouldered attendance, and then knelt down in himself beside his hacked, glittering grave, having done all things in this life that he could. There's something here, I think, of Cleopatra's redemption at the end of Horace 137. She was a ridiculous, decadent creature for most of the poem, just as Donald Armstrong is a sort of a goofy, happy-go-lucky, lovely but not especially dignified boy. But in the end, he becomes kingly, just as she becomes something like the Roman ideal in her death. He becomes truly regal, truly noble. And that subtle, it's a small compression. It's not a flashy compression. In fact, the last line is all monosyllables. All things in this life that he could. He knelt down in himself beside his hacked, glittering grave, having done all things in this life that he could. Because, of course, this was the end of his life. There was nothing else he was going to do. He had already done everything that he was ever going to do in his life, and this is the end of it. He had also done his best. He fought. He had friends. He presumably had a family. He was a good man in Dickie's recollection, or at least a pretty good one. And of course also, he had performed all of the tricks that he knew. Dickie imagines him putting on a show for the Japanese, maybe in hopes that they will spare him. And after the standing on his hands, he didn't have anything left to show them. He'd done all of it. He was out of tricks. So I'll read this one more time and then move on. But I think this is a pretty good example of a poem conveying information and doing so with real grace. And it's not quite fair, I think, to say, but it's not the information he conveys that matters. It's the delicacy of the language, or it's the compression, or it's the wit and the tone. All of these things do matter, of course. But I think it would be pretty false to the poem to say that the information isn't really what Dickie cares most about here, and maybe isn't what gives the poem most of its power. And I say that even if there was never any Donald Armstrong. Dickie was an inveterate liar, and, it's possible he made this all up. But even so, the story he tells here takes on a life of its own and becomes weighty in the telling. All right, so this is the performance by James Dickey. The last time I saw Donald Armstrong, he was staggering oddly off into the sun, going down of the Philippine Islands. I let my shovel fall and put that hand above my eyes and moved some way to one side that his body might pass through the sun. And I saw how well he was not standing there on his hands, on his spindle-shanked forearms, balanced, unbalanced, with his big feet looming and waving in the great untrustworthy air he flew in each night when it darkened. Dust fanned in scraped puffs from the earth between his arms, and blood turned his face inside out to demonstrate its suppleness of veins as he perfected his role. Next day, he toppled his head off on an island beach to the south, and the enemy's two-handed sword did not fall from anyone's hands at that miraculous sight, as the head rolled over upon its wide-eyed face and fell into the inadequate grave he had dug for himself under pressure. Yet I put my flat hand to my eyebrows months later to see him again in the sun when I learned how he died, and imagined him there, come judged before his small captors, doing all his lean tricks to amaze them, the back somersault, the kip up, and at last the stand on his hands, perfect, with his feet together, his head down, evenly breathing, as the sun poured up from the sea and the headsman broke down in a blaze of tears in that light of the thin, long human frame upside down in its own strange joy, and, if some other one had not told him, would have cut off the feet instead of the head. And if Armstrong had not presently risen in kingly, round-shouldered attendance, and then knelt down in himself beside his hacked, glittering grave, having done all things in this life that he could. All right, so that took a little while. I'm obviously not going to get through my enormous fucking list of poems, but here's one. Here's a poem I love that I fell in love with this poem in college. It's the last poem in Katie Lederer's first book, Winter Sex. And it is a poem that conveys just about no information. And I realized sometimes that is, it's not just what is conveyed instead of information, which in the case of this poem is actually very little. Because it's, as much as anything, it is a poem seemingly about the inability of conveying information. And yet it does so in a way that I find touching. I don't know as well how to talk about this poem because it is not the sort of poem I usually champion, but I love it anyway. So this is much shorter than the performance. This is called Untitled. Very helpful. This is a further lack of information. We don't even know what kind of title to think of it as. This is Untitled by Katie Lederer. It was the answer to a question. As if a sensation, derailed, had found place in something it could never be. The threat of finding place in what one cannot be. I have expected you who now arrive, and I can see your form in the doorway, and I ask you what we cannot be. Light is conducting us in toward a unity, but our instinct is against it. If we, who are answers to questions, come to this inclusiveness will ruin us. Lodged in strict formation, we are diffuse, and so we wonder what we are. There is, I think, one sentence in this poem. It's broken up into long lines and then very short lines, and the typography is such that it is a little ambiguous whether some of these are meant to be really long lines that are then indented rather than broken. But in any event, there's nothing especially flashy about the typography, and the language is fairly plain. But almost nothing is, we are informed of almost nothing. I do think there's one sentence that really makes the poem, without which the poem would absolutely fall flat. And it's this middle sentence. I have expected you who now arrive, and I can see your form in the doorway, and I ask you what we cannot be. The doorway, I mean, apart from the word light later, which is used in a pretty broad and maybe even a metaphorical sense, the doorway is the only image in the poem. And yet, I have expected you who now arrive, and I can see your form in the doorway, and I ask you what we cannot be. There's enough there. There's an I and a you, there's a doorway, there's an arrival, and there is a thwarted possibility, something they might be together and will not be, cannot be. And I think because of that sentence at the core of this poem, the decorousness, the difficulty of the rest of the poem becomes, to my ear, touching rather than frustrating. In part, I think it's because the way Lederer manages her highly abstract, highly indirect speech suggests not someone playing games in order to avoid making sense, but someone trying not to say the wrong thing. Someone trying very hard not to say the forbidden thing or the too explicit thing. Someone who would love to speak more frankly if it were possible, but it's not. So one more time, just quickly, this is Untitled by Katie Lederer. It was the answer to a question. As if a sensation, derailed, had found place in something it could never be. The threat of finding place in what one cannot be. I have expected you, who now arrive, and I can see your form in the doorway, and I ask you what we cannot be. Light is conducting us in toward a unity, but our instinct is against it. If we, who are answers to questions, come to this inclusiveness will ruin us. Lodged in strict formation, we are diffuse, and so wonder what we are. All right, my fucking desk is overflowing with books, so I got to start to shuffle some of these to the side. All right, I'm not going to get even close to through this whole list, but I do, sometimes I do go to homes for information. Sometimes I go for a poignant lack of information. I think I often go for voice. I mean, that was when Matt Wall asked me on his podcast, what is the very first thing I look for in a poem? I said, voice. And there are a lot of examples of this. I mean, I think pretty much any of the poems I really care about possess something of a palpable, detectable voice, whether it's human or just the voice of a mind that a human could imagine. I don't know, but the example, the kind of the chief example that came to mind was not even from a lyric poem, though it is I think certainly poetry. And this sent me to, there's this fascinating passage in The Origin of Species when Darwin's talking about what the nature of a species is. When I was in school, I was told, the definition of a species is that that members of a species can mate with each other and produce fertile young. But members of different species, if they mate with each other at all, they can only produce sterile young, right? This is the idea of a mule, right? This was what I was told in school. And I think as a general rule, that probably is pretty true. But Darwin said something I think pretty fascinating, which was that this isn't really in any technical sense necessarily true. He notes that every individual of a species varies from every other. There is no absolute model of an oriole or an earthworm, right? There are only instances of orioles or earthworms or human beings. And all of them vary from one another. And there are varieties of species. And he said the difference between a variety and a species is twofold. One, the variety is smaller and the species is bigger. And he says if a variety of a species flourishes so much that the main line of the species is dominated by it, then actually the variety becomes the species. And then the other distinction is degree of difference. He has one of his most brilliant metaphorical explanations in addressing this question of how species diverge. He says that the tendency is not for species to remain different but very close to each other. He says typically they will split way off because one of them begins to dominate one arena and the other dominates another, and the ones in between that are neither hot nor cold tend to die out. So the example he gives, just amazing. He's talking about these two different related species of beetle, and one flies very well and one doesn't fly at all. And he says there's actually a fairly simple explanation for why you don't have like a version of this beetle that flies a little. You basically have the super flyers and the non-flyers. He says, as with mariners shipwrecked near a coast, right? You're on a shipwreck, but you're near the coast. He says, as with mariners shipwrecked near a coast, it would have been better for the good swimmers if they had been able to swim still further, whereas it would have been better for the bad swimmers if they had not been able to swim at all and had stuck to the wreck. What you don't want to be is a pretty good swimmer who's not quite good enough and so makes it halfway to the coast, right? That's what you don't want. And I think in a similar way about the distinctions among genres of writing, right? It's not so much that I think there is this great category of poetry or of lyric poetry, but rather that there are varieties and divergences and redundancies. But, in general, lyric poetry tends to clump up around a certain set of qualities and goals. And, though some of these early on are shared with dramatic poetry, say, they begin to diverge. They begin to find their own respective specialties. This was something that happened with my siblings and I. We're all artists, and we all basically had the same education in the arts, but we sort of picked and branched off. I write, my sister plays the piano, she does music, there's a couple instruments actually, she plays drums as well. She teaches music, and my brother is a visual artist, right? I did photography and I wasn't bad at it. He did writing, he wasn't bad at it. Anna Catherine did writing. She wasn't bad at that. She certainly did a lot of visual arts, wasn't bad at that either. But we all ended up splitting off and diverging, which is not to say that any one of us is most essentially one thing or another, but rather that's sort of how it ended up. But as I said, the example that came to mind when I thought of voice and the extraordinary emotional power that is available in a well-articulated voice, the example that came to mind was Othello's death speech. One of the most beautiful speeches in English drama, but also, it's hard to think of a better death speech. He has, at the vicious coercion of Iago, he has been convinced that his beloved wife Desdemona was cheating on him, and he has strangled her. In rage, of course, Desdemona is in fact innocent, as he eventually learns. And, of course, one of the other deep tensions in the play is that Othello is black, and he is living I think, I don't know if, Shakespeare's England would have called it a white culture. He's living in Venice among Italians, but he is certainly living in an alien culture in which he is the odd man out. And this comes up in his speech. He is addressing the gathered officials who've sort of come upon this scene and discovered what's happened. And they're speaking among themselves, and he interrupts for sort of one final address to them. And he speaks very calmly, with a very level head. He is a soldier. He's a soldier through and through, and he's a very good soldier. And this, too, is apparent in his final speech. They say to him, "Bring away." And he asks them to wait for a moment, because he has something to say first. He says, "Soft you. A word or two before you go. I have done the state some service, and they know it." I love it. He had I think he was a general. He had some significant rank in the army, and he can't help but declare his right to say something, right? That these are people who in any other circumstance would be clicking their heels and following his orders, and he can't entirely let go of that, but then he recognizes what he's doing and he corrects himself. He says, "Soft you, a word or two before you go. I have done the state some service, and they know it. No more of that. I pray you. in your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice. He shares with Hamlet here an impulse to say, somebody is going to have to tell this story. Othello knows, like Hamlet, that it's a wounded name he's going to leave behind, more so than Hamlet. Hamlet's still hopeful that he will come off as the hero in the public accounts of his adventures. Though Hamlet's also a murderer, an accidental murderer. He's a little more confident. You could say he has the white privilege of seeing himself as the hero. Othello is a little bit more sober. He says, I pray you in your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice. Don't exaggerate me. Don't drag things out. Don't stretch things out beyond what they really were. And don't say things viciously just for the sake of staining my name. You don't need to. Just tell what happened. He says, then must you speak of one that loved not wisely, but too well. Of one not easily jealous, but, being wrought, perplexed in extreme. Of one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe. This is a reference that I don't think it's recorded exactly what the story is. Some people think that the text actually, instead of saying Indian, means to say Judean. But in either event, I think that the sense is clear enough that he's comparing himself to someone from an uncivilized culture, from the Venetian point of view, that would neglect to recognize, it would fail to see what he had and would throw it away. Something as precious as a pearl. Of course, that's not really what Othello did. He knew how precious Desdemona was, and that's part of what drove him to his mad rage. But he speaks of himself in the sort of the brutal, racist terms that he expects to be spoken of. He is a kind of a terrible realist in his request for fair treatment, or relatively fair treatment, in the history books. He's continuing this thought, you must speak. He says, of one whose subdued eyes, albeit unused to the melting mood. I mean, not someone who cries easily. He's a fucking soldier. Of one whose subdued eyes, albeit unused to the melting mood, drops tears as fast as the Arabian trees their medicinable gum. He's invoking foreign imagery again, something alien to the Venetian landscape, but also maybe something natural. The trees can't necessarily help what they are. He returns to these instructions for those who will survive him. He says, set you down this, and say besides that in Aleppo once. He tells this story here. This is a totally heartbreaking non sequitur. He says, tell my story, to speak of me accurately, say what I did, don't make things up. And then he says, there's one other thing. There's a story I want to tell you. And it's this sort of terrible parable. We don't know if this is a real story or if he's using it only for its climax. But the tone with which he conveys this story and the restraint involved in turning his attention away from this immediate subject to this story, which of course is not really a diversion, but a kind of dramatization. He says, set you down this, and say besides that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, in Aleppo, in the foreign land, there was a Venetian, one of our men, one of the people in my army, one of us. And maybe in this moment more one of you. I saw a Venetian and he was in trouble, a malignant and a turbaned Turk, this figure of alienness, this outsider. Not just a person of another race, of another culture, of another country, a person of another religion. right? This totally alien figure, someone who, in this story, he knows his audience cannot help but see as a stand-in for him. But in the story, he sees that this Turk is hurting a Venetian. So what does he do? Set you down this and say besides that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, he made Venice look bad. Where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog. He enters the story. Let me tell you what I did when I saw this happening. I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus. And it's in that moment that he stabs himself. He is, of course, describing exactly what he's doing in that very moment. He is killing himself for the good of the state that he loves, that he's devoted himself to, that he's sworn his loyalty to. He's fought his whole career on behalf of Venice. That is his country. And he finds himself in these last moments in the role of alien outsider, of a Moor rather than a Venetian. And he can't forgive himself for the horrible crime that he's committed. It is part of what is wrenching about this speech is that he recognizes the unfair estrangement that he suffers in this Venetian culture, but he also recognizes the reality of his own horrible crime. And he takes up the cause of the Venetian state in this moment. He is a man who believes in justice, who believes in the use of force, and he is not going to wait for others to do their duty by the state. He'll do it himself. But of course, this is also just a shattering confession and apology by someone who has just murdered the wife that he loves and realizes that nothing he says or does can ever take that back. So this is his speech again from the beginning. It's still fairly short. He says, "Soft you, a word or two before you go. I have done the state some service, and they know it." No more of that. "I pray you, in your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice. Then must you speak of one that loved not wisely, but too well, of one not easily jealous, but being wrought, perplexed in extreme, of one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe, of one whose subdued eyes, albeit unused to the melting mood, drops tears as fast as the Arabian trees their medicinable gum. Set you down this. And say besides, that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus." I'm not going to go through the meter of the poem. It is in blank verse. But just as a nod to our friend Elijah, the prosody expert, I will note that his last sentence ends mid-line. "And smote him thus." The rest of the next 3 feet are broken off. Ludovico fills them in, "Oh bloody period." But I think, interestingly, in the typography of the Norton that I have, typically when is it stickamithia? Stickamithia is the exchange of lines and dialogue. I don't know if it's the exchange of half lines, but it's typically in the typography of a play when a half line from one character fills in a half line from another character. It's indented so as to, visually carry the words from one end of the line to the other, to the character turn. They didn't do that here. Ludovico starts a new line, "Oh bloody period," even though you could argue that concludes Othello's line. I think it would be a little... I think it would probably be, in order to deliver that the way that it would be meant, if it were the conclusion of that line, it would have to be spoken all at once, and smote him thus, O bloody period, which seems tonally wrong, and dramatically wrong as well. So I think they're right to say that Othello's last line is broken. All right, so there's that. I've gone way long and still not gotten to even half of what I wanted to talk about. But maybe I'll continue this, or maybe I'll just do a secret show episode and I'll talk about a few more of these poems, because there's some just really great poems I wanted to talk about. I'll do a second part, whether on the secret show or not, I don't know. I got to give you something for your money's worth, right? I gotta make it worth your while, and if you haven't joined the secret show, come join, come. What's the line? What's the Faust line? He says, how comes it then that thou art out of hell? And Mephistopheles says, why, this is hell, nor am I out of it. All right, I think that's enough for now. I have a lot more to say about all this, but there's more to come. And maybe appropriately, there's not a category to get to the end of. There's just more poems. There's no final argument. There's no absolute definition. There's just more poems. It's not like when I get to the end of this list that I made, I'm going to have an absolute conclusion. It's just going to be a list of more things that I find in poems. And there will just be more poems in which to find them there. So yeah, I think I'm going to be a punk-ass bitch and end this 100th episode there and say thank you all so much for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com, where you can write all of your furious responses to this episode. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.